The year was 1774, and autumn had painted the Ohio Valley in shades of amber and crimson. In the small settlement of Miller's Creek, nestled between dense woodlands and the rushing waters of the Blue River, life moved with the steady rhythm of survival and hope. Sarah Coleman, 23 years old and 8 months pregnant, stood at the edge of the settlement's meager fortifications, her weathered hands resting on the swollen curve of her belly as she watched the last merchant wagon disappear into the horizon. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah, her sister's voice called from the cabin they shared, come help me with these quilts before the rain comes. But Sarah remained motionless, her grey eyes fixed on the darkening tree line. Something wasn't right. The forest, usually alive, with birdsong and the rustle of small creatures, had fallen silent. The attack came at dawn. Painted warriors burst from the woods like shadows given form, their war cries shattering the morning stillness. Sarah woke to screams and the acrid smell of burning thatch. She rolled from her bedroll, pain shooting through her swollen ankles as she searched for her sister in the chaos. "Mary!" she called out, but her voice was lost in the pandemonium. Men shouted orders, muskets fired, and horses whinnied in terror. Sarah stumbled toward the door, only to find it blocked by fallen timber from the collapsed roof. Outside, the settlement descended into chaos. James Turner, the blacksmith, tried to organize a defense at the meeting house, but the raiders had already torched half the cabins. Children ran crying through the smoke, searching for parents who might already be lost to tomahawk or flame. Sarah found a narrow opening between the burning timbers and squeezed through, ignoring the splinters that tore at her dress. The courtyard was a scene of devastation. Bodies lay scattered among the smouldering ruins. Daniel Webb, barely 17, clutched a musket with shaking hands as he tried to reload, his face streaked with soot and tears. "Where's Mary?" Sarah grabbed his arm. "Have you seen my sister?" Daniel's eyes were wild with panic. They took her. Toward the river. I couldn't..." Another war cry cut through the air. 3 warriors appeared through the smoke there, faces painted in frightening patterns of red and black. One carried a tomahawk, dripping with fresh blood. Another had an English musket he'd likely taken from a fallen settler. Sarah pressed herself against the wall of the burning cabin, her heart thundering as the heat became nearly unbearable. The roof groaned ominously above her. She had to move, but her legs felt like lead. The baby kicked hard inside her as if sensing the danger. The raiders moved past her hiding spot, searching for survivors. She could hear their guttural commands, their harsh breathing. One paused mere feet from where she crouched. Through the smoke she could see his bronze skin, the eagle feathers in his black hair, the deadly grace of his movements. A crash of falling timber sent up a shower of sparks. The warrior turned toward the noise, giving Sarah a moment to slip behind a water barrel. Her back screamed in protest, and she bit her lip to keep from crying out. She needed to think. The forest. If she could reach the forest, she might survive. She waited until the raiders moved toward the southern edge of the settlement, where the last defenders had formed a desperate line. Then, using the smoke as cover, she began to crawl toward the northern woods. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through her body. Her dress caught on roots and stones, tearing at the hem. Behind her, the battle reached its crescendo. Musket. Fire crackled like dry wood in a hearth. Men cursed and screamed. A horse galloped past her hiding place, riderless and terrified, its mane singed from the flames. Sarah had nearly reached the tree line when she heard the unmistakable sound of approaching hoofbeats. 3 horsemen emerged from the smoke, survivors, from the settlement, riding hard for the safety of Fort Henderson, 20 miles to the east. "Wait!" she called out, raising her hand. But her voice was weak, barely audible above the chaos. The riders thundered past without slowing, either unable to see her through the smoke or choosing to ignore her plight. Despair washed over her. She was alone, pregnant, and surrounded by hostile forces. The settlement was lost. The smoke began to clear slightly, and she could see the full extent of the destruction. Miller's Creek wasn't just attacked, it was being erased from existence. Movement caught her eye. A figure approached through the haze, not one of the painted warriors, but someone in buckskin clothing. Hope flared in her chest until she recognized Thomas Barrett, one of the settlement's own men, leading his horse through the devastation. "Thomas!" She raised her voice again, stronger this time. "Help me!" He turned, saw her, and for a moment Sarah thought salvation had arrived. But Thomas's face, when it emerged from the smoke, held no warmth. His eyes were hard, calculating. "Sarah Coleman." He said her name like a curse. "You're still alive." "Please!" She stepped forward, stumbling on the uneven ground. "We have to run. The fort's too far." Thomas interrupted. "Especially for someone in your condition." Sarah's blood ran cold at his tone. "What do you mean?" Thomas glanced, back the way he'd come, then looked at her again. "You'll slow me down. My horse can barely carry me as it is. Then I'll walk beside—" "No." The word was flat, final. "I've seen what they do to pregnant women they capture. Better to take your chances here. You can't just leave me." Thomas was already mounting his horse. "I've got a family to think about, my own family." He turned the horse's head toward the east. "If you make it to the river, follow it upstream. There's an old trapper's cabin about 5 miles north. Maybe you'll find shelter there before they find you." With that, he spurred his horse forward, disappearing into what remained of the smoke. Sarah stood frozen, watching her last hope of rescue abandon her. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a cold river. She was alone in a war zone, heavily pregnant, with raiders still hunting through the ruins of her home. The pain in her back intensified, radiating forward to her swollen belly. She looked down at her rounded form, at the life she carried. "I won't let them find us," she whispered to her unborn child. "We're going to survive this." With newfound determination, she turned toward the forest. The thick woods offered cover, though they also harbored unknown dangers. Behind her, the sounds of destruction continued as the raiders finished their work. Occasional musket shots suggested some settlers still fought, but those were growing, fewer and farther between. Sarah had barely taken 10 steps into the woods when a sharp cry pierced the air. She turned to see a young girl, perhaps 6 years old, emerge from behind a burned-out wagon. The child was covered in ash, her dress torn, her eyes wide with terror. "Mama!" the girl called out, searching the debris. "Papa!" Sarah's heart broke. She knew she shouldn't reveal herself, shouldn't compromise her own chances of survival, but she couldn't leave a child alone in this horror. "Here," she whispered, gesturing from the tree line. "Come here, quickly." The girl saw her and hesitated. More sounds of destruction came from the settlement center. The raiders weren't finished yet. "It's all right," Sarah soothed. "Come to me, we have to hide." The child ran to her on unsteady legs, and Sarah scooped her up despite the protest from her pregnant body. The girl buried her face in Sarah's shoulder, trembling. "What's your name?" "Sweetheart. Emma," came the muffled reply. "Emma Foster. Where's my mama?" Sarah had no answer to that. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the child and plunged deeper into the forest. The undergrowth was thick here, thorny bushes and low-hanging branches that seemed to grab at her clothes and hair. But the dense vegetation also provided cover. They moved as quickly as Sarah's condition allowed, following a game trail that wound between massive oak and maple trees. The canopy above filtered the morning light, creating a cathedral-like atmosphere. That might have been peaceful under different circumstances. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, Sarah's legs began to shake from exhaustion. She found a fallen log and lowered herself carefully, still holding Emma. "Are we safe now?" Emma asked, her voice small. "I don't know," Sarah admitted. She listened carefully to the forest sounds. Birds had begun to sing again, which suggested the worst of the violence had moved away from their location. But we're alive, and that's what matters. Emma pulled back to look at her face. Are you going to have a baby? Despite everything, Sarah managed a weak smile. Yes, I am. Very soon, I think. Will you take care of me until we find my mama? The question hit Sarah like a blade to the heart. She had no idea if Emma's parents had survived, no idea if they themselves would survive the day. But looking into those innocent eyes, she knew she couldn't voice those doubts. Yes, she said firmly, I'll take care of you. They rested for a few minutes more, then continued their journey deeper into the woods. Sarah tried to remember Thomas's directions, follow the river upstream to find the trapper's cabin. But which direction was the river from here? The sounds of water were muffled by the thick forest, impossible to pinpoint. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As they walked, Sarah's mind raced through everything that had happened. The attack had been swift, organized, and devastating. These weren't random raiders, but warriors with a clear purpose. Miller's Creek had been targeted, perhaps because of its position as a gateway to the fertile valleys beyond, or maybe because of some slight against the local tribes that the settlers hadn't even recognized. Her thoughts were interrupted by Emma tugging on her dress. I have to, the child whispered, embarrassed. Of course. Sarah helped her find a private spot behind a thick bush. While Emma attended to her needs, Sarah scanned their surroundings more carefully. The forest was old here, with massive trees that had likely stood for centuries. Moss-covered fallen logs and ferns carpeted the ground. It was beautiful in a way that made their desperate situation seem almost surreal. A sound froze her in place. Footsteps, multiple sets, moving through the underbrush, with a skill that suggested hunters rather than settlers. Sarah's heart pounded as she quickly pulled Emma back to her side, pressing a finger to her lips. The footsteps came closer. Through the trees, she caught glimpses of movement, two figures moving parallel to their position. They wore buckskin, like settlers, but their movements were too fluid, too silent for colonists. Sarah held her breath as the figures passed within 20 yards of their hiding spot. She caught a clearer glimpse. One was a man in his 30s, his long black hair adorned with feathers. The other was younger, perhaps Emma's age, also in traditional dress, but with the bearing of someone learning to hunt. They were Shawnee. Sarah had learned enough about the local tribes to recognize their style of dress and movement. These could be scouts from the raiding party searching for survivors, or they might be from a different band entirely, caught up in the violence spreading through the valley. The pair moved past, their voices carried away by the wind. Sarah waited until she could no longer hear them before allowing herself to breathe. Again, were those Indians? Emma whispered. Yes, Sarah admitted. There was no point in lying to the child about what they faced. Are they going to hurt us? Sarah considered her answer carefully. Some might, others might help us. People are complicated, Emma, even in times like these. They continued moving, more cautiously now. The forest seemed endless, an ocean of green that swallowed sound and disoriented sense of direction. Sarah's feet began to ache, and her back sent regular waves of pain through her body. Emma was tiring too, but bless her heart, she didn't complain. The sun had moved considerably in the sky when they finally heard it, the distinct sound of rushing water. The river. Sarah felt a surge of hope. If they could follow it upstream, as Thomas had suggested, they might find that trapper's cabin. But reaching the river meant leaving the cover of the trees. They would be exposed, visible to anyone, friend or foe, who might be watching from the opposite bank or the sky above. We need to be very careful now, Sarah told Emma. We're going to move to the water, but we have to stay hidden as much as possible. They crept forward, using bushes and boulders as cover until the river came into view. It was wider than Sarah had expected, perhaps 40 feet across, running fast over a bed of smooth stones. The afternoon sun sparkled on its surface, creating a deceptively peaceful scene. Sarah scanned both banks carefully. No movement, no signs of other people, but that didn't mean they were alone. "Stay close to me," she whispered to Emma. Together they followed the riverbank upstream, keeping to the shadows where possible. The sound of water masked their footsteps, but also prevented them from hearing anyone who might be following. They had been walking for perhaps an hour when Sarah felt the first real contraction. It started as a tightening across her belly, then escalated to a pain that made her gasp and grab a nearby tree for support. "What's wrong?" Emma asked, frightened by the sudden change. It's okay," Sarah managed, though sweat broke out on her forehead. "The baby is just reminding me it's there." But Sarah knew better. This wasn't just movement. This was labor beginning of labor, and they were miles from any help, any safety, any hope of proper birthing conditions. The contraction passed, but Sarah knew more would follow. She had to make a decision, press on to find the cabin, or find shelter here and prepare for what was coming. Another sound made the decision for her. Voices, human voices speaking English, coming from behind them along the riverbank. Sarah turned, hope rising in her chest. Maybe other settlers had escaped. Maybe help had arrived from Fort Henderson. Maybe the hope died as quickly as it had formed. 2 men emerged from the trees, but they were raiders like Thomas, men who had chosen survival over honor. She recognized Jacob Miller, whose family had given the settlement its name, and Henry Walsh, who had been one of the original founders. Both men were armed, both on foot, both with the look of men who had made hard choices. Well, Jacob said, his voice carrying easily over the rushing water. "Sarah Coleman, we thought you were dead." Sarah instinctively moved Emma behind her. "Jacob, Henry, thank God you're alive." "Alive and moving," Henry confirmed. He was older than Jacob, his beard graying at the edges. "You should be too. Raiders will be back to clean what they left." "We're looking for the trapper's cabin," Thomas mentioned. Sarah said carefully. 5 miles upstream," he said. Jacob laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. "Thomas made it, did he? Must have been riding like hell itself was chasing him." "Will you help us?" Sarah asked directly. "I'm going to have my baby soon, I think. I found Emma hiding in the settlement. She needs—" "We can't," Henry interrupted. "We've already got our hands full." "What do you mean?" Jacob gestured behind them. Sarah had been so focused on the men that she hadn't noticed the small group they'd been shielding. 3 children, all under 10, huddled together, 2 women, one of whom was bleeding from a scalp wound. "Collected these folks from the ruins," Jacob explained. "Martha Walsh is Henry's wife. The others are Millers, my cousins. We're making for the Kentuck settlements, not the fort. Raiders came from the fort direction. But the cabin, forget the cabin," Henry said bluntly. "You join us. You keep up. Anyone who can't walk fast enough stays behind. That's the rule." Sarah looked at the group, then down at Emma, then at her own swollen belly. She could barely keep up on her own. With Emma and labor beginning, she would slow them down disastrously. "I understand," she said quietly. Then, making one of the hardest decisions of her life, she turned to Emma. "Sweetheart, you need to go. With these nice people, they'll take you somewhere safe." "No." Emma clutched at her dress. "I want to stay with you." Jacob stepped forward. "Kid, we can't—" Another contraction hit Sarah, stronger than the first. She gripped a tree, her knees buckling. "Take her," she gasped. "Take her, please." Henry was already moving forward gently, but firmly separating Emma from Sarah. "Come on, child. We'll find your family, I promise." Emma fought for a moment, crying, but the other women in the group swooped in to comfort her. Within minutes, the survivors' Po-Tem group was moving again, disappearing upstream along the riverbank. Sarah was alone again. She slumped against the tree, fighting back tears. She had saved Emma, but at what cost to herself? Another contraction reminded her that, ready or not, her baby was coming. The afternoon sun was beginning to sink toward the horizon. Sarah knew she had to find shelter before dark. The trapper's cabin might still be ahead, but she couldn't count on reaching it before labor demanded her full attention. She pushed off from the tree and continued upstream, each step more difficult than the last. The riverbank was rocky here, uneven, challenging even for someone in good condition. She stumbled frequently, catching herself on overhanging branches or convenient boulders. Contractions came more frequently now, each one forcing her to stop and breathe through the pain. The baby had dropped lower, pressing against her pelvis. She had helped with enough births in the settlement to know she didn't have much time. When she finally found shelter, it wasn't the cabin she'd hoped for, but a shallow cave formed by an overhang of rock. Fallen logs and thick bushes created a natural screen that would hide her presence from casual observers. It would have to do. Sarah gathered what she could for a makeshift bed: moss, leaves, pine boughs. She found a fallen branch, sturdy enough to use as a support when the time came. She even managed to gather some wood for a fire, though she dared not light it until absolutely necessary. As the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Sarah felt the reality of her situation settle over her like a heavy blanket. She was alone in the wilderness, about to give birth without assistance, surrounded by dangers both animal and human. Her settlement was destroyed, her sister's fate unknown, and she had just given up the child who had depended on her. The first real labor pain doubled her over just as the stars began to emerge. In the growing darkness, Sarah prepared to bring life into a world that had shown her nothing but destruction that day. But she was alive. Her baby was alive. And somehow, against all odds, they would survive the night. The night pressed in around Sarah like a living thing, thick with possibilities both terrifying and unknown. Each contraction brought a fresh wave of uncertainty. How many more hours before the baby came? Would she have the strength to deliver alone? And what dangers lurked in the darkness beyond her makeshift shelter? A rustle in the underbrush froze her blood. Through the pain-induced haze, she listened intently. There were deliberate footsteps approaching, careful but not silent. Too careful for a settler, too obvious for a predator. Her mind raced. Raiders, coming to finish what they started. Or perhaps those Shawnee scouts she'd glimpsed earlier. From the gloom emerged a figure that defied her expectations. A woman, elderly but upright, moved through the darkness with surprising grace. She wore buckskin adorned with intricate beadwork, her long silver hair braided and decorated with feathers and shells. In her weathered hands, she carried a leather pouch and a bundle of herbs that filled the air with an unfamiliar, not unpleasant scent. Their eyes met across the small clearing. The old woman's gaze moved from Sarah's face to her swollen belly, then back again. She spoke in accented English, each word carefully chosen. "Child comes soon." It wasn't a question. Sarah pressed herself against the cave wall, every muscle tensed for flight or fight. "Who are you?" "I am Nipaya, medicine woman of the Shawnee." She gestured to the herbs. "These will help with pain." And she glanced. "Around the crude shelter, you need a better place for baby to be born." Another contraction hit, and Sarah couldn't suppress a cry. When it passed, she found Nipaya had moved closer, her dark eyes filled with concern rather than malice. "Your people attack mine. Mine attacked yours," the old woman said. "But baby knows no enemies. Baby only knows life wanting to begin." Sarah's defenses crumbled under the weight of her desperation. "Please," she whispered, "I don't want to die here alone." Nipaya nodded once, decisively. "Come, my son's lodge is not far. Women help you there. Your son, Tecumseh." The name was spoken with obvious pride. He is away, but his wife, Watawa, knows how to give birth. With effort that taxed her remaining strength, Sarah stood. Nipia supported her, surprisingly strong for her age. Together, they made their way through the forest, following paths invisible to Sarah's settler-trained eyes. The medicine woman spoke softly as they walked. Whether to calm Sarah or to mask their passage, she couldn't tell. In our village, women help women bring life. Enemy or friend, this is woman's sacred duty. Nipia paused to adjust Sarah's weight as another contraction hit. Men make war. Women make peace through children. The lodge appeared like magic between the trees. Built in a style entirely unfamiliar to Sarah, it was a curved dwelling of bent saplings covered with bark and skins. Smoke drifted from the opening at the top, and warm light spilled from the entrance. 3 women emerged as they approached, their faces initially wary, until Nipia spoke in rapid Shawnee. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward. "I am Watawa. You are welcome in our home at this time." Her English was clearer than Nipia's, suggesting more contact with settlers. "The baby comes fast?" I think so," Sarah managed between breaths. This is my first." Watawa nodded and turned to the other women, issuing quick instructions. Within moments, Sarah found herself guided inside the lodge, where the air was warm and scented with sweet grass and other herbs. Furs had been arranged in a circular area at the center, and the women moved with practiced efficiency to prepare the space. "Sit," Watawa instructed, gesturing to the furs, "or walk. Your body will tell you what it needs." As Sarah lowered herself onto the soft pelts, memories of the morning's violence threatened to overwhelm her. These were the people who had destroyed her home, killed her neighbors. Yet here they were, offering comfort and aid at her most vulnerable moment. The contradiction twisted in her mind like the contractions in her body. Why? The question burst from her, unbidden. Why help me after everything? Nipia had taken a seat nearby, arranging her pouches and bundles. She looked up at Sarah with ancient eyes that seemed to see beyond the immediate moment. "Because this is the way it has always been," she said slowly. "Before your people came with your ways, before the first Shawnee learned to make fire, women helped women bring life to the world. This truth remains when all else changes." Watawa brought a cup containing steaming liquid. "Drink slowly. It will help with pain and give you strength for what comes." The tea was bitter but oddly refreshing. As Sarah sipped, she observed the interior of the lodge more carefully. It was larger than it appeared from outside, with various items hanging. From the frame, weapons, tools, dried herbs, and decorative objects she couldn't identify. Everything had its place, suggesting a life of order and tradition far different from the rough frontier existence she'd known. "Where are the men?" she asked, then immediately wondered if she should have. "Hunting," Watawa replied simply. "You're gone 3 days, should return soon." She exchanged a glance with Nipia that suggested they were purposely not mentioning the morning's raid. Another contraction, stronger than before, drove thoughts of everything else from Sarah's mind. She gripped the furs beneath her as waves of pain washed over her. The women moved closer, speaking soothing words in both Shawnee and English, their hands gentle as they checked her progress. "Strong baby," one of the younger women pronounced, her hand on Sarah's belly. "Wants to meet this world." Time lost all meaning in the dim light of the lodge. Sarah discovered herself moving between walking and resting, finding positions that eased the increasing intensity of labor. The Shawnee women attended her with a mixture of ancient wisdom and warm comfort she'd never expected to find. During one of her walking periods, Nipia pressed something into her hand, a smooth stone, warm from being carried in her pouch. "Hold this when pain comes. It carries the strength of the Earth Mother." Sarah clutched the stone through the next contraction, surprising herself by finding comfort in its solid weight. When the pain ebbed, she met Nipaya's eyes. "My sister, Mary. She was at the settlement. Did you hear?" The old woman's face softened. "Many were taken west toward the big river, some hurt, some not. Warriors do not tell women. All things?" She paused, considering her words. "But I heard of a young woman with hair like corn silk. She fought with courage, they say." Hope flickered in Sarah's chest. If Mary had been taken alive, there was a chance they might be reunited someday. The thought gave her strength for the next contraction. As night deepened around the lodge, the women prepared for the baby's arrival. Watawa produced soft deerskin for swaddling, while another woman stoked the fire to ensure warmth. They moved with purpose, born of long practice, their movements speaking of countless births attended. "In my village," Watawa said, working to prepare a birthing position, "we have a ceremony for baby's naming. The father speaks to his clan and gives the child its spirit name. But for you—" She paused, uncertain how to proceed. "I have no family here," Sarah admitted. The words came with their own pain, separate from the physical. "My husband died last winter. My sister is gone. I'm alone." "Not alone," Watawa said firmly. "Tonight, we are your family. The baby will have witnesses to its entry to this world." The rhythm of contractions intensified, and Sarah found herself entering a space beyond conscious thought. Her body knew what to do. Ancient knowledge passed down through generations of women. The Shawnee women supported her, offering herbs for strength, cool water to wet her lips, and constant encouragement. "Baby turns," Nipia announced after checking Sarah's progress. "Come in soon now." The final stage of labor overwhelmed Sarah with its intensity. The lodge walls seemed to pulse with her efforts, the fire casting dancing shadows that moved in time with her breathing. Through the haze of pain and effort, she was aware of the women around her. Watawa holding her hand, Nipaya chanting. Softly in Shawnee, the younger women ready with cloths and warm water. With a final push that seemed to tear her apart and remake her simultaneously, Sarah brought her child into the world. A cry split the night air, strong, healthy, demanding. Through tears of exhaustion and relief, she watched Watawa clean and examine the baby with expert hands. "Son!" Watawa announced, wrapping the infant in soft deerskin before placing him in Sarah's arms. "Strong son, 10 fingers, 10 toes, good lungs." Sarah cradled her baby, overwhelmed by the surge of love and protectiveness that rushed through her. He was perfect. Dark hair damp from birth, tiny features already distinctive, eyes that seemed to look right through her to something beyond. "John," she whispered, naming him for her father. "John Coleman." Nipaya had brought another tea, this one for after-birth recovery. As Sarah sipped, the old medicine woman began cleaning herbs and tools with practiced efficiency. "Baby born during darkness. In our way, this means he will see the truth others miss. Will walk between worlds." Between worlds? Born of white. Mother in an Indian lodge, helped by the hands of different peoples, he carries both in his spirit already. Outside, a wolf howled in the distance, answered by another farther away. The sound reminded Sarah that the world beyond the lodge continued its dangerous existence. The war that had driven her here still raged, communities destroying each other, in an endless cycle of violence and revenge. "What happens now?" she asked, reality seeping back in as the birthing euphoria faded. "I can't go home. There is no home." Watawa and Nipaya exchanged a long look, communicating silently in the way of women who had shared many life events. "Dawn comes soon," Watawa said. "Men return from hunt at dawn. You decide then, stay or go." "Some are angry," the younger, Woman warned, speaking for the first time. Lost brothers in mornings fighting. They do not understand white women in the village. But others remember, Nipia added, that we are all human, that life is a sacred gift no matter whose body carries it. Sarah understood. The same prejudices and hatreds that had driven the morning's massacre existed here as well. Not all. Shawnee would welcome her presence, even after what had transpired in their lodge. As the women continued cleaning and organizing, Sarah fed her newborn son for the first time. He latched eagerly, already strong with life's determination. Watching him nurse, she made her decision. "I'll leave at first light," she said firmly. "You've done more than enough, more than I had any right to expect. I won't bring the conflict into your village." "Where will you go?" Watawa asked. "The fort, or maybe to the Kentucky settlements, somewhere I can start again." She looked down at John, feeling strength return with purpose. Somewhere he can grow up without the weight of this war. Nipia began gathering items from around the lodge. Strips of dried venison, medicinal herbs, a small water gourd. "For Journey," she explained at Sarah's questioning look. "And this," she lifted a small deerskin pouch, beautifully decorated, with intricate beadwork. "For the baby, protection charm, will keep safe from bad spirits." "I don't know how to thank you," Sarah began, but Nipia waved away her words. "You don't. You remember. You tell a story to a little one when he grows. Tell him that people can choose kindness even when the world chooses hate." As they spoke, a commotion arose outside the lodge. Voices, the sound of horses, the return of the hunting party. The women's expressions grew tense. Watawa moved to the entrance, calling out in Shawnee. A male voice responded, then another, the tones ranging from surprise to angry. "My son returns," Nipia said quietly, "and others with him. They will have questions." Sarah held John closer, preparing herself for whatever came next. Through the lodge's entrance, she could see shadows moving in the pre-dawn light, tall figures carrying weapons, their movements speaking of men trained for war. The entrance flap lifted, and the first man entered. He was striking, muscular, build, intelligent eyes, and bearing that suggested natural leadership. This had to be Tecumseh, Nipia's son. His gaze moved from his mother to Watawa, then settled on Sarah with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Explain," he said simply. As the other men gathered outside, listening, Nipia recounted the events of the night. She spoke in Shawnee, but Sarah could follow the general meaning through gestures and the few English words interspersed. When the tale reached its conclusion, a heavy silence fell over the lodge. Tecumseh studied Sarah again, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke in English that, while accented, was clear and formal. "You are the enemy of my people. Your people burned villages, took land, broke treaties. Why should we not send you from here?" The question hung in the air, challenging. Not just Sarah, but the actions of the women who had helped her. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze steadily. "You shouldn't," she replied. "I ask for nothing but the chance to leave peacefully. Your mother and Watawa acted from compassion that honors your people. I'll tell no one about this place, no one about what happened here. Words are easily spoken, true, but actions matter more." She shifted John in her arms. "This morning I hated your people for what they did to my home. Tonight they saved my child's life. I can't reconcile those truths, but I can acknowledge them both exist." A murmur ran through the gathered men. One, younger and clearly angry, spoke rapidly in Shawnee. Tecumseh listened, then responded with words that sounded like both rebuke and teaching. The young warrior looked chastened but unconvinced. "Blackfish asks why we don't keep you as hostage," Tecumseh translated. "Or send scouts to track your friends, use you as bait." "Because," Nipia interrupted, speaking in English for all to understand, "that is not our way with women who birth in our village. Every child born under Shawnee roof carries protection of Shawnee spirits. We cannot break this sacred law. The morning light grew stronger, painting the interior of the lodge in shades of gold and copper. Sarah realized the debate had subtly shifted from whether to allow her to leave to how best to ensure her safe departure. When the sun fully rises, Tecumseh decided, you will go. 2 warriors will guide you to the trader's path, halfway to your fort. After that, you travel alone. The baby? Watawa asked, concerned. He is too young for such a journey. Life forces us to have strength we don't know we have, Tecumseh replied. He looked at Sarah. You saved Shawnee child before, in your settlement. Small girl you protected when others fled. Sarah's heart quickened. Emma, is she safe? Tecumseh confirmed. With her people now. Blackfish watched over her when war fever ran high among our young warriors. We repay protection with protection. The knowledge that Emma had survived lifted a weight from Sarah's heart she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Perhaps some good would come from this terrible day after all. I'm ready. Sarah began gathering her strength and the items Nipiah had prepared. With help from Watawa, she secured John against her chest, using a strip of soft deer skin fashioned as a carrier. One more thing, Tecumseh said. He removed a carved shell pendant from around his neck, a piece that clearly held significance. This marks you as under Shawnee protection. If you meet our people again, show this. They will know you have earned safe passage. Sarah accepted the pendant with trembling fingers. Why? She had to ask. Why show such kindness to an enemy? Tecumseh's response came slowly, thoughtfully. Because too much hatred has already passed between our peoples. Because my mother sees the truth others miss, that in times of war, small acts of peace become more important than great acts of violence. Because perhaps someday your son and my sons might not know each other as enemies. As the first rays of sunlight pierced the lodge's entrance, Sarah prepared to leave the shelter that had become both sanctuary and paradox. She embraced Watawa, promised to remember Nipiah's teachings, and finally stepped outside. The village was stirring to life, with warriors preparing weapons and women tending fires. Many stared at the white woman emerging from their midst, but none moved to stop her. The 2 guides Tecumseh had assigned, one the younger warrior called Blackfish, the other a stoic middle-aged man, waited with prepared horses. Sarah looked back once as they reached the edge of the forest. Nipiah stood in the doorway of the lodge, raising one weathered hand in farewell. Somehow in that gesture, Sarah saw not just goodbye, but a blessing for the difficult journey ahead. The forest closed around them as they began riding. Blackfish led the way, his movements efficient but wary. He had lost friends in the morning's conflict, Sarah realized, and protecting her went against every instinct trained for war. As they rode, memories of the previous dawn's violence played. In her mind, like a dark tapestry, she had awakened in a world of violent certainties, us versus them, civilization versus savage, right versus wrong. But birth and its attendant miracle had shattered those simple truths. The trader's path appeared sooner than expected, a wider trail that showed signs of regular use. Her guides halted at this boundary between worlds. Blackfish spoke for the first time in slow English. From here we watch until you no longer see. He pointed to a rocky outcrop overlooking the trail. If danger comes before you go beyond sight, we help once more. After that, your spirits must guide. Sarah understood this was more than she had any right to expect. Tell Tecumseh his kindness honors him and his people. Tell his mother. Tell her I will raise my son to know that enemies can become family when life demands it. She urged her borrowed horse forward onto the trader's path. With each step, the distance grew between her past life and whatever future awaited. Behind her, she could sense, rather than see, her Shawnee guardians taking up positions to fulfill. And their final duty. The sun climbed higher as she rode, John quiet against her chest, seemingly content with this new mode of travel. Birds sang in the canopy above, and small creatures rustled in the undergrowth. The forest showed no sign of yesterday's violence, nature already beginning to heal what humanity had torn apart. When she finally lost sight of the rocky outcrop, Sarah knew she was truly alone again. But unlike the desperate solitude of the previous evening, this aloneness carried a different quality. She was no longer the same woman who had fled her burning settlement. Thoughts crystallized as she rode. She would make it to Fort Henderson, then perhaps continue south to the Kentucky settlements where new communities were forming. She would raise John with knowledge of both his heritage and the Shawnee who had given him life. Most importantly, she would carry forward the truth that enemies could become healers when confronted with humanity's most fundamental struggle, the bringing of new life into a harsh world. The pendant Tecumseh had given her rested against her heart, its carved surface warming in the morning sun. She touched it occasionally, drawing strength from its solid reality. Whatever stories she would tell in years to come, whatever tales of frontier danger and unexpected salvation, this small shell would serve as proof that sometimes miracles wore the faces of those we'd been taught to fear. As the morning advanced, Sarah's thoughts turned practical. The trail would likely lead to other travelers, traders, trappers, perhaps even settlers from other communities. She would need to decide how much to reveal of her night among the Shawnee, how to balance gratitude with the prejudices she would inevitably encounter. A sound ahead drew her attention. Horses, multiple riders approaching from the direction of the fort. Sarah's first instinct was to hide, but she suppressed it. She was no longer hiding, no longer fleeing. She was a mother traveling to secure her child's future. The riders appeared around a bend, 3 men, armed and watchful. They wore the rough clothes of frontier scouts, and their faces showed the wariness of those who had seen recent conflict. "Halt!" the lead rider called. "Identify yourself." Sarah drew herself up straighter in the saddle. "Sarah Coleman, of Miller's Creek, or what's left of it." The men exchanged glances. "Miller's Creek got hit yesterday," one of them said. "Few survivors made it to the fort, said the settlement was completely gone." "It is," Sarah confirmed. "I escaped with help." "From who?" The moment of truth had arrived sooner than expected. Sarah made her choice carefully. From others who were escaping, settlers heading for Kentucky country. "They gave me this horse to make it to the fort." It wasn't entirely a lie, she reasoned. Tecumseh's people had enabled her escape, even if not in the manner the scouts would assume. The pendant rested against her heart like a secret that would remain protected. "You alone." The lead scout's eyes moved over her disheveled appearance, taking in the newborn pressed against her chest. "That baby wasn't born yesterday." "Last night," Sarah admitted. "We need to reach the fort. Will you escort us?" The scouts consulted, briefly before agreeing. As they turned toward Fort Henderson, bringing Sarah into their protective circle, she allowed herself one last look back along the trail she'd traveled. Somewhere in those woods, Blackfish and his companion were returning to their village. They would report her safe departure, completing their unusual mission. Tecumseh would nod approval of duty fulfilled. Nipia would perhaps add more herbs to her sacred pouches, preparing for the next time humanity required healing. And in their lodge, Wattewa would return things to normal. But the firs where Sarah had given birth would carry the memory of a night when ancient traditions bridged the gap between peoples at war. The journey to Fort Henderson would take the rest of the day. As they rode, one of the scouts, a man named Jenkins who seemed inclined to conversation, shared what he knew of the wider conflict. "Been brewing for months," he explained. "Treaties broken on both sides, land disputes, the usual, but something's different this time. They're saying there's talk of a great leader rising among the tribes, someone trying to unite them all." Against us? Sarah asked. Against everyone who's not them, Jenkins replied grimly. Could be a long war coming. The words settled over her like a heavy cloak. John stirred against her chest, and she adjusted his position. He would grow up in a world shaped by this conflict, whether she liked it or not. But perhaps, armed with the knowledge that humanity could transcend hatred, even in its darkest moments, he would help forge a different path. As they neared Fort Henderson, the traffic on the trail increased. Other refugees arrived with stories of similar raids throughout the valley. The violence hadn't been isolated to Miller's Creek, but part of a coordinated assault that would reshape the landscape of frontier settlement. The fort appeared in late afternoon, a bastion of rough-hewn timber and desperate determination. Guards called out challenges as they approached, and Sarah prepared herself for the questions that would follow her arrival. She had prepared a narrative, close enough to truth to hold under questioning, distant enough from complete honesty to protect those who had saved her. She would speak of hiding in the woods, of giving birth alone, of finding the trader's path at dawn. The pendant would remain hidden, its significance known only to herself and those who had granted it. As they passed through the fort's gates, into a courtyard, crowded with newly arrived refugees, Sarah felt the final echoes of her extraordinary night slip away. She was returning to her own world, to familiar prejudices and accepted enmities, but she carried with her knowledge that would forever change how she viewed the conflicts tearing their frontier apart. John opened his eyes as they dismounted, his newborn gaze seeming to take in this new stage of their journey. Sarah pressed her lips to his forehead, whispering a promise that only he could hear. "I'll tell you the truth when you're old enough," she murmured. "I'll tell you about the medicine woman with healing hands, about the warrior who chose peace in the middle of war, about how life can bloom even in hatred's shadow." The fort's commander approached to take her statement, and Sarah straightened her shoulders to face whatever came next. Her survival story would become one of many shared that day, not remarkable for its miracles, but for its testament to frontier endurance. But she alone would know the deeper truth, that sometimes salvation wore war paint and spoke ancient languages, that compassion could bridge gaps hatred had carved, and that a single night could contain within it all the paradoxes of a conflict consuming their world. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire that echoed the previous dawn's destruction, Sarah Coleman entered the next chapter of her life. She carried with her a child who would be raised to see enemies as potential allies, war as potential peace, and difference as potential understanding. The pendant pressed against her heart was more than jewelry or protection charm. It had become a symbol of possibility, proof that in their frontier war humanity might yet find a path to coexistence. Whether that path would be walked by many or remain a secret known to few, only time would tell. But for now, Sarah focused on immediate needs: food, shelter, and the beginning of a new life built on the ruins of the old. She had survived an impossible night and emerged with more than just her life intact. She carried knowledge that could, perhaps someday, help heal the wounds that divided their world. Until then, she would protect her son, honor the memory of those who had saved them both, and wait for the day when their frontier's violent divisions might give way to the kind of understanding she had witnessed in a Shawnee lodge on the night her child entered the world. 3 months passed at 40. Henderson, each day a careful balance between recovery and preparation for the unknown. Sarah established herself in the cramped quarters reserved for refugees, tending to other settlers' needs while her own strength slowly returned. Her skills in midwifery, learned helping women in Miller's Creek, proved invaluable as more displaced families arrived with various ailments and concerns. John thrived despite their uncertain circumstances. The fort's commander, Stern-faced Colonel Matthew Douglas had surprised her by showing unexpected kindness to the refugees, perhaps reminded of his own family back east. His wife Eleanor had taken particular interest in Sarah's situation, helping arrange better quarters and providing some basic necessities. "You've seen things most never will," Eleanor Douglas observed one evening as they sat by the fire. The colonel's wife had cultivated a small herb garden within the fort's walls, and they were preparing remedies together. "Most women who escape raids arrive with nothing but terror in their eyes. You have something different." Sarah carefully ground herbs in the wooden bowl before her. "I learned that survival takes many forms. Sometimes salvation comes from unexpected sources." Eleanor studied her carefully but didn't press for details. Sarah had become adept at sharing just enough truth to satisfy curiosity without revealing the full, extraordinary nature of her escape. The other refugees gradually wove their own tales into the fort's communal fabric, stories of narrow escapes, unexpected heroism, crushing loss. Among these refugees was Thomas Barrett, the man who had abandoned her during the raid. His conscience had eventually driven him to the fort, where he immediately sought her out. His face carried the weight of guilt like a physical burden. "I should have stayed," he confessed during their first encounter, standing awkwardly at the door of her small quarters. "Should have helped you." Sarah shifted John to her other hip, considering the man before her. 3 months ago, she might have harbored resentment. Now, having experienced something that transcended simple notions of right and wrong, she found only understanding. "You made a choice many would have made," she told him honestly. "I've learned that fear reveals who we truly are, and sometimes that truth isn't comfortable." Thomas became her unofficial protector within the fort, helping with tasks that proved challenging for a single mother. But more importantly, he brought news from beyond their walls, news that both troubled and intrigued her. "The tribal confederacy is growing," he reported one evening as they mended tools in the fort's workshop area. "They're saying a young war. Chief is uniting different bands, Shawnee, Miami, Wyandotte, even some Cherokee from the south." "Do they mention a name?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Tecumseh, they call him. Means shooting star in their tongue. Makes speeches about driving all settlers back across the mountains." The name struck her like a physical blow. The man who had shown her mercy now led the very forces threatening her adopted community. The paradox twisted in her mind. How could the warrior who had protected her lead attacks against her people? "They say he's different from other war leaders," Thomas continued, unaware of her internal struggle. "Doesn't kill prisoners unnecessarily, won't allow torture, but he's deadly serious about stopping white expansion." That evening, after Thomas had left and John slept peacefully in his cradle, Sarah found herself fingering the carved shell pendant. She kept hidden beneath her dress. Tecumseh's gift carried new complexity now. Had his kindness been an exception, a moment of humanity within a larger campaign of resistance? Or did it represent something deeper, a conflict between personal honor and political necessity? Her opportunity to seek answers came sooner than expected. 2 weeks after Thomas's revelations, traders arrived at the fort with troubling news. A party of settlers en route to Kentucky settlements had vanished. Their last known position was along the Ohio River, in territory increasingly claimed by various tribal bands. Colonel Douglas called for volunteers to search for survivors. Sarah felt compelled to join, her experience during the Miller's Creek raid having taught her skills others lacked. She could read forest signs, understood basic herbal medicine, and possessed knowledge of how the displaced might hide to avoid detection. "Absolutely not," Eleanor Douglas protested when Sarah announced her intention. "You have a child to consider. Let the Rangers handle it." "I can help," Sarah insisted. "I know things the Rangers don't know about surviving alone in the wilderness. And I speak some words now." This last claim wasn't entirely truthful. She knew perhaps a dozen phrases gathered from her night with Nipia and Watawa, but it strengthened her argument. The search party assembled 3 days later. Sarah arranged for Eleanor to care for John, though leaving him proved more difficult than she'd anticipated. At 3 months, he had begun smiling in recognition, his tiny hands grasping at her face when she held him. Leaving him behind felt like abandoning part of herself. 12 riders departed Fort Henderson at dawn, including Sarah as the only woman. The rangers grudgingly accepted her presence after she demonstrated her tracking skills, pointing out subtle signs of wildlife movement they had missed during their preparations. They followed the Ohio River westward, moving cautiously through territory that had become increasingly contested. Captain James Langford, leading the Rangers, proved a capable commander who listened when Sarah offered insights about potential hiding places or signs of recent passage. On the 3rd day, they found evidence of the missing settlers, an overturned wagon hidden in thick underbrush near the riverbank. The scene told a story of desperate concealment rather than immediate attack. Personal belongings remained scattered but not thoroughly looted, suggesting the occupants might have fled at first sign of danger. "They're alive," Sarah concluded, examining the tracks. "Moved on foot, heading southeast, maybe trying to circle back toward the settlements." The Rangers wanted to pursue immediately, but Sarah noticed something that gave her pause. Among the tracks were others, moccasin prints following the settlers' path, not pursuing aggressively, but shadowing their movement. "Someone's tracking them," she reported to Captain Langford. "But these prints—" She studied them more carefully, a chill running down her spine. Something about their pattern seemed familiar. "They're keeping their distance, like scouts watching, rather than hunting." As they followed the settlers' trail deeper into the wilderness, Sarah's unease grew. The forest here felt different, charged with an energy she couldn't quite identify. They were entering the heart of disputed territory, where both sides had grown increasingly bold in their claims. Late on the 5th day, they finally caught up. With the missing settlers, 6 adults and 3 children, exhausted and near starvation. The reunion was joyful but brief. The settlers reported being followed for days, catching glimpses of figures in the woods, but never being directly confronted. "They were testing us," insisted Martin Wheeler, the group's leader, "waiting for us to weaken, but they never attacked." Something clicked in Sarah's understanding. This wasn't typical raiding behavior. It suggested discipline, strategy, perhaps even the kind of measured approach Tecumseh reportedly favored. As they prepared to return to the fort, Captain Langford's men remained on high alert. The forest seemed to watch them, though no direct threat materialized. Sarah found herself noting details the trained rangers missed: broken twigs at specific heights, disturbed earth patterns suggesting organized movement. They made camp on their first night of return journey in a defensible position near a small stream. The rescued settlers huddled together, still jumpy from their ordeal. Sarah helped tend various injuries and ailments while the rangers set watches. It was during her own watch, deep in the night, that she saw him. A figure emerged from the darkness. Beyond their camp's perimeter, tall, commanding, unmistakable even in silhouette. Tecumseh stood at the edge of their campfire's light, making no attempt at concealment. He wore a silver armband that caught the firelight, his bearing suggesting neither threat nor submission. Sarah's breath caught. Should she raise an alarm? The other guards were positioned to miss this angle. This moment, this impossible encounter, seemed to exist outside normal reality. Tecumseh raised one hand slowly, palm forward in a gesture of peace. His other hand touched something at his chest. She knew without seeing that he wore a shell pendant like the one he'd given her. The message was clear. He sought a private audience. Moving with careful precision to avoid alerting the guards, Sarah signaled understanding. She slipped away from the camp, using tactics learned from her own desperate flight months ago, following a route that would bring her to where Tecumseh waited. They met in a small clearing, perhaps 50 yards from the camp, far enough to avoid discovery, but close enough for her to still hear shouts if danger arose. Moonlight filtered through the canopy, creating a scene that felt suspended between dreams and reality. "You return to the forest," Tecumseh observed without greeting, his English flowing smoothly. "Many paths you could have chosen, yet you chose. The woods." "I could say the same," Sarah replied. "Your men shadowed these settlers for days without attacking. That's not the behavior I'd expect from a war leader." A slight smile touched his features. "You think you understand my methods? I understand the man who showed mercy in his mother's lodge may not be the same as the war chief who threatens frontier settlements, but I wonder which is the real Tecumseh." He was silent for a long moment. There is an old Shawnee saying, "The river has many currents, but it is still one river." I am both the son who honors life in women's sacred time and the leader who fights for our land. These are not different men, but different expressions of the same spirit. Sarah steadied herself against a tree, fatigue from days of riding and her own emotional turmoil taking their toll. "Why are you here? Why reveal yourself to me?" "Because you carry our pendant. Because you understand what others do not, that this war will consume everything unless new paths are found." He gestured toward the camp. "Those people you rescued, we could have taken them days ago, but our scouts reported they had women with child, children barely walking. We are not monsters." "Then what are you fighting for?" "For our home, for our way of life. Your people see empty woods and claim it. We see villages our people built for generations, hunting grounds that fed us for centuries. How do we make peace when your peace means our annihilation?" The question cut deeper than any blade. Sarah had lived through the destruction of her own home, had felt the pain of displacement. Now she understood that pain existed on both sides. "Of the conflict, I don't know," she admitted, "but I know that understanding begins with seeing the other as human. You gave me that gift. I'm trying to honor it." Tecumseh studied her carefully. "And your people? Do they see us as human when they tell stories of savage Indians? Some do, many don't, just as some of your people see us only as invaders, while others—" She touched the pendant beneath her dress. "Others remember that kindness can cross any boundary." A sound from the camp, a guard changing position, reminded them both of the precarious nature of their meeting. Tecumseh straightened, his posture shifting from conversational to military. "Take a message to your fort," he said formally. "Tell your Colonel Douglas that Tecumseh offers temporary safe conduct for all settlements between here and Kentucky Territory. 3 months. No raids, no attacks. Let this be time for thought, for seeking paths other than endless blood." Sarah was stunned. "You're offering a truce?" "I'm offering breathing space. My confederation grows strong, but I'm not blinded by war fever. If your people use this time to consider true negotiation rather than continued expansion, perhaps fewer will die. And if they don't," his eyes held hers steadily, "then when fighting resumes, let it not be said we gave no chance for peace." He began to fade back into the forest's shadows, but paused. "Your son, is he grows well?" The personal question caught her off guard. "He thrives," she answered softly. "Eleanor Douglas helps care for him while I'm away." "Good. It would be unfortunate if violence reached him before he grows to make his own choices about war and peace." With that, Tecumseh vanished completely into the darkness, leaving Sarah alone with moonlight and churning thoughts. She remained motionless for long minutes, processing the extraordinary encounter and its implications. When she finally crept back to camp, her watch replacement was just arriving. He noticed her slightly disheveled appearance, but assumed she'd stepped away briefly for personal reasons. She resumed her place among sleeping forms, but rest proved impossible. Dawn revealed the forest as peaceful as any other morning, birds singing their normal symphony while camp life resumed its familiar patterns. Only Sarah carried knowledge of the night's secret meeting. The journey back to Fort Henderson proceeded without incident, the promised safe conduct apparently extending beyond Tecumseh's meeting. The rescued settlers slowly regained their spirits, sharing stories of their ordeal that Sarah now understood in a new context. On their 7th morning of travel, they encountered another party heading west. 3 wagons of settlers determined to reach Kentucky despite the warnings. Captain Langford tried persuading them to turn back, but they pressed forward with the stubborn optimism that characterized frontier expansion. 3 months, Sarah murmured, remembering Tecumseh's offer. She wondered if she should share it, knowing the information could save lives, but also reveal her impossible encounter. The dilemma resolved itself when they finally approached Fort Henderson. A messenger rode out to meet them carrying urgent news. Similar offers of temporary truce had been presented to other frontier forts. Envoys bearing white flags had arrived at Fort Harmar and Fort Finney, each carrying the same message: 3 months to consider alternatives to perpetual conflict. Colonel Douglas greeted their return with relief, tempered by confusion. "The chiefs know our military situation is stronger than last season," he confided to Captain Langford. "This offer doesn't make tactical sense unless they're planning something." Sarah held her peace, understanding what military minds could not, that sometimes offers of peace emerged from personal conviction rather than strategic calculation. She focused instead on reuniting with John, whose delighted burbles at seeing her again nearly brought her to tears. Over the following weeks, Fort Henderson buzzed with debate about the Shawnee offer. Some settlers advocated aggressive action during the truce, arguing it was mere manipulation. Others, particularly women who had lost husbands and sons to the endless fighting, begged for genuine peace talks. Sarah found herself caught between worlds more deeply than ever before. She assisted Colonel Douglas in drafting dispatches to Eastern authorities, while also helping translate basic Shawnee phrases when occasional envoys arrived to reaffirm Tecumseh's offer. Her unique position, neither purely settler nor sympathizer, but something more complex, allowed her to bridge gaps others couldn't cross. During this period, her friendship with Thomas Barrett evolved into something deeper. He had proven reliable and kind, helping with John's care and respecting her need for occasional solitude. His guilt about abandoning her had transformed into dedicated support that never demanded more than she offered. One evening, as they watched children play in the fort's courtyard while John slept in her arms, Thomas asked carefully, "Do you ever think about staying here, making a permanent life at the fort?" "I think about many things," Sarah replied, knowing her answer failed to satisfy his deeper question. How could she explain that part of her heart now belonged to forest paths and shell pendants, to the moment when enemies had transformed briefly into family? The truce held through autumn's transition to winter. Trade tentatively resumed on some routes. Frontiersmen reported decreased tensions, though mutual suspicion remained high. Both sides used the pause to strengthen defenses and plan for whatever followed. Sarah's role expanded beyond medicine and translation. She became an unofficial advisor on matters requiring cultural understanding, explaining why certain gestures might offend Shawnee sensibilities, helping interpret mixed messages from the scattered reports filtering in from the frontier. Colonel Douglas grew to value her insights. "You see things differently," he observed during one of their strategy sessions. "Most see only friend or enemies. You see complications." "Life is complicated," she replied. "Peace requires acknowledging that complexity rather than simplifying." into comfortable absolutes. Winter deepened, bringing its own challenges. Food supplies ran low despite careful rationing. 2 fierce blizzards buried the fort in snow that took days to clear. During these hardest times, the community drew together, regardless of old prejudices. It was during the second blizzard that Emma Foster reappeared. The child arrived with a trapping party, returning from the north, gaunt but alive, clutching a doll made of corn husks and deerskin. Recognition struck both of them simultaneously across the crowded mess hall. "Emma!" Sarah called out, and the child broke free from her escorts to run into her arms. The reunion brought tears to many eyes. Emma's story spilled out in fragments. Taken in by a French-Canadian trapper and his Indian wife, carried north to safer territory, learning to speak a mixture of languages while growing skilled at forest survival. But through it all, she had remembered Sarah, the woman who had protected her during those first terrible hours of violence. "You had your baby," Emma observed, marveling at John's sleeping form. "Is it a boy or girl?" "A boy," Sarah confirmed, "named John." "Like your father," Emma remembered. Her memory proved remarkable for her age, recalling details of their conversations during those desperate hours hiding in the forest. As winter's grip slowly loosened, rumors arrived from the east that forced everyone to face hard realities. The British were reportedly arming tribes throughout the Ohio Valley, encouraging resistance against American expansion. The 3 months were ending, and neither side had used the respite to build lasting bridges. On the eve of spring equinox, a formal council gathering was announced. Envoys would meet on neutral ground to determine whether the temporary peace could evolve into something permanent. Colonel Douglas was commanded to participate, bringing advisors who understood native protocols. To everyone's surprise, including her own, Sarah was included among those advisors. Her experience bridging cultural gaps, combined with her unusual journey from survivor to mediator, made her valuable despite protocol typically excluding women from such proceedings. The council ground lay 50 miles west of Fort Henderson, at a place where 2 rivers merged. Travel would be dangerous despite the truce, requiring careful coordination and multiple guarantees of safe passage. Sarah faced the wrenching decision once again of leaving John behind, though Eleanor Douglas promised constant care and Emma volunteered as assistant babysitter. "You're going toward the danger to make things safer," Eleanor pointed out as they prepared for departure. "That's brave beyond measure." "It's necessary," Sarah corrected, though her heart ached watching John's curious face as she packed for the journey. "I've seen too much to turn away from chances at real peace, however slim." Thomas surprised her by requesting permission to join the escort. "You went searching for lost settlers," he reminded her. "Let me search for peace alongside you." The journey to council ground proved uneventful, Tecumseh's safe conduct holding through coordination between rangers and tribal scouts. They reached the meeting place on a cloudy morning that threatened rain, finding elaborate preparations already in progress. Representatives from multiple tribes had assembled: Shawnee, Miami, Wyandotte, Delaware, even distant Cherokee. The English had sent observers. American officials arrived from eastern territories. The gathering represented perhaps the most diverse collection of competing interests ever assembled in the region. Tecumseh greeted each delegation formally, showing particular courtesy to those who had honored the 3-month truce. When he reached Sarah among Colonel Douglas's advisors, their eyes met briefly, acknowledging their secret meeting without revealing its details to others. "You bring your healing skills to meet the healing of nations," he said in English. The formal observation carried private meaning, that her presence represented hope for wounds extending beyond individual suffering. The proceedings began with traditional ceremonies from various tribal customs, followed by formal statements of position from all parties. Sarah served primarily as translator and cultural interpreter, helping prevent misunderstandings that could derail negotiations. It soon became clear that fundamental disagreements remained. American representatives demanded continuing settlement rights while offering increasingly remote reservations for native peoples. Tribal leaders insisted on boundaries that reflected centuries of occupation and use. The English quietly encouraged tribal resistance to American expansion. During breaks in formal sessions, Sarah found herself in demand for informal mediation. Her ability to see complexity rather than choosing rigid sides proved valuable in easing tensions that arose from cultural misunderstandings. She explained why certain white gestures seemed disrespectful to tribal elders while helping settlers understand why some native requests weren't the insults they appeared. On the third evening, as frustrated delegates returned to their separate camps, Tecumseh requested private counsel with Colonel Douglas. Sarah was asked to translate, her unique position as bridge between cultures, requiring her presence at sensitive discussions. They met in a central lodge erected specially for this purpose. Tecumseh spoke with characteristic eloquence about his vision for coexistence, territorial boundaries respected by both parties, regulated trade that benefited all, cooperative response to outside threats. "Your people seek to spread like floodwaters," he observed, "but the flood destroys what it covers. We ask that settlement flow like rivers instead, strong but contained within banks that nourish rather than devastate." Colonel Douglas listened, carefully, occasionally asking Sarah to clarify nuances of meaning or cultural reference. When Tecumseh finished his presentation, the colonel sat in thoughtful silence before responding. "Your words paint a picture many would see as reasonable," he admitted. "But you must understand, my people flee poverty and persecution in the East. They see these lands as final hope for their families. Asking them to limit themselves goes against everything they came here to achieve. And asking my people to surrender our homeland goes against our existence as a people," Tecumseh countered. "Yet neither of us benefits from endless war. Our children grow up knowing only violence. Our women bear the cost while bearing the next generation. Surely there must be wisdom great enough to find balance." The exchange continued late into the night, positions shifting slightly but core disagreements remaining. Sarah found herself actively participating rather than merely translating, offering perspectives drawn from her unusual journey between worlds. "I've lived as a settler," she shared when asked directly by Tecumseh. "I've received kindness from those I was taught to fear. I've seen how fear destroys understanding on both sides. Perhaps the answer lies not in drawing new boundaries, but in finding ways to respect boundaries already written in land and history." Her words hung in the smoky air of the lodge. Both men studied her, seeing in her scarred experience a mirror of larger conflicts. "What would you propose?" Colonel Douglas asked seriously. Sarah hesitated, aware she was stepping far beyond her formal role. But the moment demanded honesty from all who hoped for true resolution. "Create zones of interaction," she suggested slowly, "instead of absolute separation. Establish places where peoples can meet, trade, learn from each other. Let marriages between cultures build bridges stronger than any treaty. Allow children to grow up seeing the other side as human rather than enemy." Tecumseh and Douglas exchanged glances that suggested neither had expected such boldness from their translator. The radical nature of her proposal challenged conventional thinking on both sides. "This would require transformation of heart as well as policy," Tecumseh acknowledged. "Perhaps that's exactly what we need," the colonel replied thoughtfully. The private council extended into dawn, with breaks for rest and sustenance, but no abandonment of the complex dialogue. Sarah found herself drawing strength from unexpected sources. Memories of Nipier's wisdom, Eleanor Douglas's practical compassion, even Thomas Barrett's journey from guilt to redemption. As morning light filtered through the lodge's covering, they had sketched the framework of something unprecedented, a plan that acknowledged native sovereignty while allowing controlled settlement, that protected traditional ways while encouraging beneficial change, that built cooperation against common threats rather than perpetual division. But the framework wasn't a treaty. The formal council sessions that followed proved how difficult translating conversation into consensus remained. Hardliners on both sides resisted compromise. The British subtly undermined progress when it threatened their interests. Personal animosities erupted over details that symbolized larger conflicts. Sarah worked tirelessly between sessions, helping moderate hot tempers and clarify confused translations. She shared meals in both the native camp and settler quarters, learning that similar hopes and fears existed beneath surface differences. On the sixth day, tension reached a breaking point. A group of young warriors had reportedly attacked a settler cabin despite the truce, killing 2 and taking prisoners. The American delegates demanded satisfaction. Tribal representatives insisted these were renegades who didn't recognize Tecumseh's authority. Blood calls for blood, several American voices insisted, threatening immediate military response. Blood has called blood for generations, Tecumseh responded, his voice carrying both authority and weariness. When do we decide blood has called enough? The council teetered on the edge of collapse. Late that evening, as delegates prepared to abandon negotiations, Sarah sought out Tecumseh privately again. Don't let it end like this, she pleaded, not after everything we've tried to build. Don't let it end like this, she pleaded, not after everything we've tried to build. Tecumseh sat by a small fire, his face creased with concern. The young warriors echo voices I spoke when I was their age. How do I tell them to be wiser than I was then? By showing them the wisdom you've gained since, Sarah replied. You've seen another path is possible. I'm proof of it. John is proof of it. The hundreds who've lived through this truce without violence are proof that something better exists. He studied her carefully in the firelight. And if we fail, if war returns worse than before, then we fail knowing we tried for more than endless death. She hesitated before continuing. I've learned that miracles often begin with impossible choices. Your mother showed me that. You showed me that. Let history record you chose the impossible rather than the inevitable. The next morning, council reconvened with a different energy. Tecumseh had called a pre-dawn gathering of tribal representatives, speaking in languages Sarah couldn't fully understand, but with passion that transcended words. The American delegates, guided by Colonel Douglas, arrived with a willingness to address the renegade attack through joint investigation rather than immediate vengeance. Consensus remained elusive, but the commitment to seeking it persisted. They established working groups to address specific issues: territory borders, trade regulations, justice for crimes across cultural lines, provisions for peaceful interaction. Sarah divided her time between these working groups, her growing son back at the fort, and the complex personal connections she'd formed. Thomas's steady presence provided stability, while Emma's resilient spirit reminded everyone what they fought to protect. The council extended beyond its planned duration, spring's full bloom arriving as negotiations deepened. Sarah received regular updates about John through fast riders. Eleanor reported he was attempting to crawl now, showing determination that made people smile despite current tensions. Throughout these extended negotiations, Tecumseh proved an inspiring leader who could balance firm advocacy for native interests with genuine openness to creative solutions. Colonel Douglas revealed diplomatic skills beyond his military background, finding ways to present compromises that satisfied honor on both sides, but breakthrough remained just beyond reach. The fundamental question persisted: could two vastly different ways of life share the same land without one overwhelming the other? Late one evening, after particularly frustrating sessions, where each side made demands the other couldn't accept, Sarah found herself walking alone along the river that had given this gathering place its name. The sound of merging waters seemed to mock their attempts at merging cultures. Tecumseh appeared beside her, having approached silently in the dimming light. "You walk with heavy thoughts," he observed. "I walk wondering if we're chasing an impossible dream," she admitted. "Maybe the best we can hope for is honorable separation rather than true integration." "Perhaps," he acknowledged. They stood in silence, watching the two rivers become one, despite originating from different sources. "Or perhaps," he continued, "we look for models in the wrong places. Rivers merge because they flow toward the same destination, the great waters beyond. Maybe our peoples need a shared purpose greater than our divisions." His words sparked something in Sarah's mind, a possibility so obvious in retrospect that she wondered why they hadn't seen it before. "Common defense," she said slowly. "The British arm tribes against settlers, but they also arm settlers against tribes. They encourage conflict to weaken both sides for their own benefit. What if our shared need to resist outside manipulation became the foundation for cooperation?" Tecumseh's eyes gleamed with interest. "Enemies of my enemy." Exactly. Not as friends, but as peoples sharing a land we're both trying to protect from those who would use us against each other. They hurried back to their respective camps, the new framework energizing preparations for the next day's formal session. Sarah worked late into the night, consulting with Colonel Douglas and his advisors, while also seeking perspectives from tribal delegates who remained approachable. The session began with Tecumseh rising to speak. He stood at the edge of formal gathering space, firelight playing across features that had become increasingly familiar to all present. "Brothers, sisters, rivals, neighbors," he began, using the most inclusive terms. "We have spoken of lines we won't cross, demands we won't meet, histories that divide us. Tonight I propose we speak instead of threats we cannot face alone." He outlined the British strategy of supporting both sides while ultimately serving only themselves. He cited instances where arms provided to fight had been deliberately insufficient, where conflicting promises had ensured continuing violence. "Our war against each other serves only those who profit from our destruction," he concluded. "I suggest a temporary alliance to resist outside manipulation. When British influence is neutralized, then we negotiate our future as peoples with real choice, not as pawns in foreign game." The proposal stunned many, but resonated with growing awareness among both native and settler leadership. Colonel Douglas rose to respond, having been prepared for this approach. "The warrior speaks wisdom," he acknowledged formally. "If we channel our courage against common threat rather than each other, perhaps we forge strength that neither could achieve alone." Debate continued long into the night, but the fundamental shift in perspective opened new possibilities. By morning, outlines of alliance against British interference had emerged. Not perfect agreement, but recognition that survival sometimes demands unexpected cooperation. The months that followed tested this fragile alliance. British agents worked hard to undermine the emerging cooperation, spreading rumors and offering increased support to faction opposed to peace. But the bond formed through necessity proved surprisingly strong. Sarah returned to Fort Henderson carrying news of the evolving agreement and a personal transformation evident to all who knew her. She had entered the council as translator and emerged as mediator, bridged between worlds she'd only begun to understand. John's recognition of her return brought tears and laughter. 5 months old now, he seemed to sense his mother carried new purpose along with familiar comfort. Emma helped care for him, while Sarah worked with civil authorities to implement the council's preliminary agreements. Thomas proposed marriage during quiet hours when autumn returned. Sarah accepted, finding in him a partner who understood her complex journey without demanding she simplify it to comfortable narratives. Their wedding was small but meaningful, bringing together survivors from Miller's Creek and new friends from frontier life. Among the gifts was a beautifully crafted blanket, delivered without announcement, but bearing unmistakable signs of native craftsmanship. Sarah recognized Nippia's work in the intricate beadwork pattern, a blessing for new beginnings that transcended divisions. As winter preparations began, the temporary alliance against British interference showed its value. Joint patrols along disputed waterways prevented smuggling operations that had fanned tribal resentments. Trade agreements, though limited, brought necessities to both settler and native communities facing harsh months ahead. Yet peace remained fragile, threatened by legitimate grievances on both sides and those who profited from conflict. Sarah found herself drawn into continuing mediation, helping navigate crises that could reignite full hostilities. The shell pendant remained her constant companion, reminder of the night that changed everything. Sometimes she wondered about its power, whether touching it brought luck or whether its presence simply reminded her that impossible transformations sometimes began with single acts of unprecedented kindness. Spring brought new challenges. Aggressive, settlers pushed beyond agreed boundaries. Hunting parties clashed over territory rights. Disease struck harder than usual after winter's isolation, creating needs that strained available resources. But spring also brought hope. Children from both communities who had lived through the extended truce showed less instinctive fear of the other. Young people on both sides learned basic words in each other's languages. The first cautious intermarriage between trader and tribal member occurred, creating personal bonds stronger than political agreements. Sarah's role continued evolving. She helped establish schools where children could learn enough of both cultures to prevent future misunderstandings. She trained other women in frontier medicine, incorporating healing knowledge shared discreetly by tribal medicine workers. Most significantly, she began documenting the stories from both sides of the frontier. Conflict, preservation of truth that defied simple categorizations of hero and villain, victim and aggressor. These accounts would become valuable for future generations, trying to understand how peoples learned to choose coexistence over mutual destruction. One evening, as she watched John take his first wobbling steps while Emma applauded and Thomas stood ready to catch him, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary path that led to this moment of simple joy. She had fled a burning settlement as a terrified widow, abandoned by those who should have protected her. She had given birth alone in a cave, saved by those she'd been taught to fear. She had bridged impossible gaps through necessity, compassion, and the accidental wisdom of a child born between worlds. The frontier war continued in various forms. Complete peace remained elusive, though the unprecedented cooperation between traditional enemies prevented the escalation many had predicted. The British eventually reduced their interference as their strategy backfired, instead producing the very unity they'd sought to prevent. Years would pass before full treaties could secure lasting peace. Many conflicts would need resolution. Misunderstandings and betrayals would still occur, though less frequently as understanding grew. But something fundamental had shifted. Where once stood only mutual hatred, now existed the possibility that ancient enemies could learn to share a vast land. Where violence had seemed inevitable, now survival sometimes demanded cooperation. Sarah never forgot the extraordinary circumstances that shaped her transformation from terrified refugee to bridge between worlds. She told her children, for more would come, creating a blended family that reflected the frontier's emerging complexity, about the night when enemy hands delivered new life, when war paint concealed faces of mercy, when miracles wore the disguise Of those we'd been taught to hate, the shell pendant passed eventually to John, then to his children, carrying the story through generations. Each successive bearer learned that peace often begins with impossible choices, that understanding requires seeing beyond surface differences to recognize shared humanity. In later years, Sarah would sometimes walk beside the merged rivers, remembering conversations held beneath stars that witnessed both war's fury and mercy's quiet triumph. She would touch the carved lines made with long-ago tools in a distant lodge, feeling in them proof that when survival demands transformation, enemies can indeed become saviors. The frontier's story, like all human stories, held no perfect resolutions, but it held possibilities, that prejudice could transform into understanding, that violence might give way to dialogue, that ancient hatreds need not define future generations. And in those possibilities, kindled by extraordinary events and maintained, through daily choices, to choose peace over the easy comfort of conflict, lay hope not just for one frontier, but for all humanity's struggle to transcend division and find common ground. The shell pendant, worn to smoothness by years of prayer and remembrance, remained testament to the truth that in history's darkest moments, ordinary people sometimes discover the extraordinary courage to choose another path. And in choosing that path, perhaps save not just themselves, but the possibility of transformation for all who follow. 14 summers had passed since that fateful night, yet the riverbanks remembered differently. Where Fort Henderson once stood, alone, now a bustling trading hub flourished. Its name had evolved to Two Rivers Crossing, reflecting the merger of settlement and tribal commerce. Sarah's graying hair caught morning light as she supervised the weekly market. Children of every heritage darted between stalls, where furs mingled with imported textiles, traditional medicines shared space with farm produce. Her daughter Ruth, born 3 years after John, translated effortlessly between languages her parents still struggled to master. "Mother, the Kansas delegation has arrived early," Ruth called across the courtyard. At 17, she'd inherited Sarah's fair skin, but Emma's quick wit, serving as junior mediator when disputes arose over trading rights. The Kansas riders broke news that shifted everything. Federal officials planned to relocate eastern tribes westward, straight through their carefully balanced territory. The Indian Removal Act threatened to undo generations of hard-won cooperation. That afternoon, emergency councils convened simultaneously. Sarah found herself crossing familiar ground to where Tecumseh's village had expanded into something resembling a small township. His hair showed silver now, though his bearing remained undiminished by time's passage. "Your President Jackson," he said without greeting, "sends pretty words about permanent Indian territory while promising settlers our land." His English had shed its accent entirely, shaped by decades of negotiation. "Not my president," Sarah corrected automatically. "Not anymore. We've built something different here." The crisis forced unprecedented alliances. Two Rivers Crossing had become an anomaly federal authorities increasingly viewed with suspicion. Their success proved frontier harmony possible, making them dangerous to those promoting separation policies. John, now 15, surprised everyone by requesting permission to ride east with a delegation of tribal youth and settler children. "Let them see what works," he proposed boldly. "Let them meet children who know no other way." The delegation's departure marked a turning point. For the first time, frontier solutions might influence Eastern policy rather than merely reacting to distant decisions. Meanwhile, Sarah's medical practice faced new challenges. The mixing of peoples had introduced unfamiliar diseases, requiring innovative treatments. She collaborated with Nepiah's apprentices. The old medicine woman had passed peacefully 2 winters prior, but her knowledge lived on through careful training. Summer brought the Federal Inspector General Crawford, tasked with evaluating Two Rivers Crossing's unusual arrangement. His initial skepticism gradually eroded as he witnessed daily cooperation that transcended racial boundaries. "Back east we debate theory," Crawford confided during a private meal with Sarah and Thomas. "Here, you've created living proof that integration needn't destroy either culture." His report to Washington praised the economic benefits of cultural exchange, while warning that forced relocation threatened proven successes. Whether Eastern politicians would heed frontier wisdom remained uncertain. Autumn's council gathered representatives from 17 different tribal bands and 23 settler communities. The stakes had never been higher. Federal law threatened to classify all natives as removable, regardless of existing treaties or local arrangements. Sarah proposed a radical strategy: declare Two Rivers Crossing a sovereign protectorate under mutual native and settler administration. Such legal maneuvering might shield them from relocation orders while providing a model for other frontier regions. "We need lawyers," Thomas admitted, having evolved from survivor to respected carpenter politician. "Men who understand federal law well enough to use it against itself." Emma's networks proved invaluable. Now 21 and married to Jerome Martin, son of refugees who'd arrived years ago, she maintained correspondence with legal reformers and frontier advocates across multiple states. Winter brought an unexpected ally. Samuel Austin, the judge who'd presided over the Joint Justice Council years earlier, arrived as formal representative from President Jackson's opposition. His presence lent credibility to their independence movement. "Your experiment," Austin declared during public address, "demonstrates what federal policy desperately needs: proof that frontier development need not mean frontier war." The legal framework took shape through countless meetings. They proposed Two Rivers territory, neither fully state nor reservation, but hybrid jurisdiction recognizing both settler and tribal sovereignty. John's delegation returned in early spring with mixed news. Eastern audiences were fascinated but skeptical. Many couldn't conceive of successful integration, having only known conflict or forced separation. "They kept asking how we keep peace without military control," John reported to the assembled council. "Couldn't understand that peace isn't absence of conflict, but practice of resolution." His words carried weight beyond his years. The delegation's youth message had reached sympathetic congressmen who now questioned removal's universal application. Ruth proposed establishing teaching exchanges. Young people from other communities could spend seasons at Two Rivers Crossing, learning practical cooperation while carrying those skills home. Education became their strongest advocacy. The federal response came that summer, a compromise that protected established integrated communities while allowing for strategic relocations elsewhere. Two Rivers Crossing earned provisional recognition as experimental territory. Victory celebrations lasted 3 days. Though Sarah found little time for revelry, the agreement protected them temporarily, but required proving their model's durability and expandability within 1 year. She spent evenings documenting their history, determined to leave an accurate record for future generations. The shell pendant, now worn by Ruth, featured prominently in her account, physical reminder that miracles often began with simple choices to help rather than harm. Tecumseh's final visit came that winter. Cancer had taken hold despite all medicine could offer. He walked the familiar paths around Two Rivers Crossing, pausing where his lodge once stood. "I fought for our land," he told Sarah during their last private conversation. "But you and others like you taught us that land means little without people willing to share it justly." His passing marked an era's end, yet his vision continued through younger leaders who'd learned that strength included the courage to admit when old ways failed new circumstances. The year of evaluation brought scrutiny from all directions. New settlers sought admission to their territory, testing capacity for expansion. Distant tribes requested guidance on replicating their success. Federal officials demanded detailed records proving economic and social benefits. Sarah established the Chronicle Project, comprehensive documentation of how Two Rivers Crossing functioned. Every conflict resolution, every economic transaction, every cultural exchange received careful recording. Thomas led initiatives proving integrations, economic superiority. Shared water management prevented flood damage other communities suffered. Combined hunting practices ensured sustainable wildlife populations. Joint defense against external threats required fewer resources than separate militaries. The spring evaluation visit proved decisive. Federal commissioners, expecting primitive compromise, discovered a sophisticated society that honored both traditions while creating something entirely new. Your success, led Commissioner John Caldwell admitted during final assessment, makes continued investment in removal appear short-sighted. Congress needs evidence that practical alternatives exist. Their success protected not just Two Rivers Crossing but influenced frontier policy generally. Other communities began adapting their methods, creating corridor of cooperation through otherwise hostile territories. Emma's children, the firstborn fully expecting integration as normal, demonstrated how quickly adaptation occurred across generations. Her son spoke 3 languages by age 5. Her daughter led playgroups that unconsciously practiced diplomatic skills they'd need as adults. John's path surprised no one when he chose formal study of frontier law. His unique perspective could bridge legal systems that still viewed each other suspiciously. He planned returning to strengthen their legal framework against future challenges. Ruth's leadership abilities emerged through practical experience. She mediated disputes with instinctive understanding of when to apply which cultural approach. Her generation would build on foundations predecessors laid. As the 15th anniversary of the treaty approached, Sarah reflected on their improbable journey. That desperate night when enemy hands delivered new life had birthed more than one child. It had birthed new possibilities for human cooperation. Walking beside the rivers at sunset, she remembered Tecumseh's final words about land meaning little, without people willing to share it justly. Two Rivers Crossing hadn't eliminated conflict, but had created a framework for resolving it without destroying communities. The pendant, passed to Ruth, continued marking generations who chose understanding over isolation. Its simple beauty reminded all who wore it that sometimes humanity's greatest achievements arose from its darkest necessities. Federal recognition arrived officially that autumn. Two Rivers territory acknowledged as a successful experiment worth protecting and studying. The order allowed them to maintain their hybrid administration while receiving federal resources for expansion. More communities requested guidance on implementing similar systems. Sarah found herself traveling as an advisor rather than a refugee, sharing hard-won wisdom with settlers and natives alike who sought paths beyond endless warfare. Winter solstice brought traditional celebrations from multiple cultures, blended now into Two Rivers tradition. Children performed combined dances their grandparents might have found shocking. Shared feast tables reflected agricultural practices that produced abundance through cooperation. The future remained uncertain. It always would be where human societies evolved. But Two Rivers Crossing had proven that frontiers' violent divisions weren't inevitable. With patience, courage, and willingness to see beyond inherited prejudices, different peoples could build something richer than either culture alone could achieve. One Rivers Crossing had proven that frontiers' violent divisions weren't inevitable. With patience, courage, and willingness to see beyond inherited prejudices, different peoples could build something richer than either culture alone could achieve. As Sarah prepared for another winter, she knew their work continued. Each generation would face new challenges to their integration, new reasons to retreat into comfortable separation. But they also inherited tools for building bridges, language skills, cultural knowledge, and most importantly, lived experience proving that cooperation brought greater strength than division. The shell pendant would pass through many hands, each bearer learning that miracles often required choosing the difficult path of understanding over the simple path of hatred. And in those choices, made daily by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, lay hope that humanity might yet learn to live together on their shared frontier, not as conquerors and conquered, but as neighbors bound by mutual respect and common purpose. Two rivers crossing stood as testament to what frontier communities could achieve when survival demanded evolution beyond ancient enmities. The experiment that began with a pregnant woman fleeing destruction and finding salvation in unexpected hands had grown into living proof that frontiers need not be battlegrounds. They could become meeting places where old worlds merged to create something entirely new. Not through surrender of identity, but through expansion of what identity could mean when shaped by shared purpose rather than inherited division. The rivers continued their ancient merger, indifferent to human settlements, on their banks. But those settlements had learned to honor the river's example, flowing forward while accepting new tributaries, creating strength through combination rather than isolation. And in that flowing forward, they wrote new chapters in frontier history. Chapters, not of conquest and resistance, but of adaptation and alliance, proving that sometimes the bravest choice was to risk believing that yesterday's enemies could become tomorrow's family. 25 years after the treaty signing, the American frontier had transformed once more. Ruth Barrett, now 37, stood before an audience of state legislators, her mother's shell pendant gleaming at her throat. The chamber buzzed with anticipation as she prepared to address the crucial question: could Two Rivers Crossings experimental society serve as a model for territories joining the Union? Distinguished delegates, she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone raised between worlds, I've been asked to explain how our community maintains peace where others find only conflict. But first, I must tell you a story. She recounted that fateful night decades ago, not as distant history, but as living memory passed down through family tales. Her mother's story, her father's redemption, the choice that saved more than one life. The pendant I wear was given by a Shawnee war chief to a pregnant settler woman who should have been his enemy. It represents our fundamental truth. Humanity's greatest strength lies in choosing compassion when fear demands hatred. The legislators listened, many for the first time understanding that frontier cooperation wasn't theoretical abstraction, but practical necessity born from extraordinary circumstances. Outside, the chamber, Two Rivers Crossing prepared for its silver anniversary celebration. 3 generations now called it home, including some who'd never known it any other way. Martha Caldwell, the commission member's daughter who'd fallen in love with a local Wyandotte farmer, had just been elected to the town council. Her election symbolized how thoroughly integration had penetrated local governance. John Barrett, now 40, returned from his law practice in St. Louis bearing news. The Supreme Court case challenging territorial autonomy had reached final stages. Their successful experiment might soon face its ultimate legal test. The opposition argues we've created a constitutional anomaly, he explained to assembled community leaders. They claim hybrid jurisdiction undermines state authority and federal Indian policy. We've proved hybrid works better than separation, Thomas Barrett countered firmly. At 63, Sarah's husband still commanded respect as master, craftsman whose furniture adorned homes throughout the territory. The question is whether law serves people or people serve law. The anniversary celebration proceeded despite legal uncertainties. Modern conveniences, telegraph lines, early railroads had reached Two Rivers Crossing without destroying its unique character. If anything, connection to the wider world strengthened their resolve to demonstrate that pluralistic society could thrive. Emma Caldwell's grandson performed a dance combining traditional Shawnee movements with European musical instruments, representing artistic fusion that now characterized frontier culture. Children who learned mathematics in English, history in French, and spirituality in multiple traditions saw no contradiction in their layered heritage. During the evening ceremonies, a surprise arrival shifted the gathering's energy. James Dearwater, elderly now, but still commanding, led a delegation including members from the very band that had attacked Miller's Creek all those years ago. They carried a formal apology, acknowledging how that raid had inadvertently catalyzed the transformation both sides needed. War taught us only death, Dearwater pronounced in carefully practiced English. Your grandmother, he nodded to Ruth, taught us life could grow from mercy's seed. Sarah sat watching from the place of honor, now 71 but still alert. The pendant's twin given to Thomas rested against his heart as he clasped forearms. With former enemies, in a greeting that spoke volumes about forgiveness's power. The court's decision arrived mid-celebration. Standing Rock, the territorial capital, erupted in cheers as messengers rushed through streets, sharing news. Hybrid jurisdiction. Upheld! Two Rivers Crossing's experimental government proved constitutional, establishing precedent that would influence frontier policy for generations. Ruth's children, Samuel and Catherine, 13 and 11, understood significance even at their young ages. They'd grown up expecting cultural fluidity as normal, preparing them for a world increasingly defined by connection rather than isolation. Later that evening, as festivities continued, Sarah found herself alone beside the rivers. Memory carried her back to that desperate night when she'd crawled through burning wreckage, abandoned by those who should have protected her, saved by those she'd been taught to fear. 25 years, 3 generations, a community that proved harmony possible not through forced assimilation or imposed separation, but through patient building of mutual understanding. Contemplating our strange journey? Thomas joined her, his hand finding hers with practiced ease. Contemplating how many might have died in endless war, if not for random kindness, she replied. How many villages might have burned? They stood, in companionable silence, watching moonlight dance on merging waters. The pendant felt warm against Sarah's chest. It always seemed to on significant nights, though she suspected imagination worked stronger magic than ancient charms. Ruth approached, carrying a document case. Mother, the committee wants your signature. On the official history, they're creating a permanent archive of our development. Sarah accepted the stylus, adding her mark to a document that would preserve their unusual story. But even as she wrote, she knew that lived experience taught more than written words ever could. The archive, housed in the educational center, Emma, had founded years earlier, would serve as a resource for communities across the nation attempting similar experiments. But success required more than copying external structures. It demanded willingness to see beyond taught hatreds, to recognize shared humanity, to choose curiosity over fear, to risk vulnerability in hope of finding an ally instead of an enemy. As celebrations wound down, the younger generation continued dancing, while elders shared memories beside dying fires. 5-year-old Daniel Caldwell, Martha's son, performed his first public dance, mixing traditional steps with modern innovation, his generation's culture evolving naturally rather than through conscious effort. The following months brought an influx of visitors from territories considering hybrid governance models. Ruth, now recognized authority on frontier integration, addressed audiences explaining that their success depended less on governmental structures than on community willingness to evolve beyond ancient divisions. "We didn't start as enlightened pioneers," she emphasized during one address. "We started as desperate survivors, forced to choose between endless war and dangerous trust. Survival demanded evolution we couldn't have imagined before necessity compelled it." John's legal expertise proved crucial as Two Rivers Crossing navigated expanded autonomy. The Supreme Court decision allowed them to establish courts recognizing both traditional tribal justice and settler legal codes, radical development that required sophisticated administration. The new court system, co-administered by native and settler-descended judges, heard its first official case 3 months after the ruling. Property disputes between families who'd intermarried generations ago tested whether a combined legal framework could function practically. Sarah attended proceedings, watching Ruth translate not just language, but legal concepts that had no direct equivalence between systems. The resolution, combining compensation traditions with property law precedents, satisfied both parties while establishing a template for future cases. That autumn brought Sarah's first great-grandchild, Ruth's son, Samuel's daughter, born to him and his Lenape wife Hannah. The baby, named Maria after Sarah's lost sister, represented the 4th generation, knowing only integrated society. "I wonder about Mary," Sarah confided to Eleanor Douglas one evening. Now 92, Eleanor's mind remained sharp despite Body's increasing frailty. Whether she survived, whether she knows what grew from that terrible day. "You planted seeds that flowered beyond imagining," Eleanor assured her. "Whether Mary sees the garden matters less than its existence helps others grow their own." Winter brought responsibilities befitting Sarah's status as community matriarch. Young couples sought her blessing for marriages crossing cultural boundaries. Families consulted her wisdom when children struggled, balancing multiple heritage demands. Her experiences bridging worlds remained relevant even as society evolved. The Telegraph brought news in early 1840. California gold discovery might reshape Western settlement patterns entirely. Fort Henderson's successors debated how massive migration might affect their careful balance. Ruth proposed a proactive strategy. Rather than react to incoming waves of fortune seekers, Two Rivers Crossing should position itself as a gateway community, teaching practical cooperation before settlers reached more contested territories. "Every miner passing through carries our story westward," she argued before council. "Make partnership with natives seem wise economics rather than romantic idealism." The strategy proved successful. Mining teams learning to respect native knowledge of terrain returned higher yields. Communities adopting cooperative models reported fewer conflicts, greater stability, and improved long-term prospects. Sarah's health declined that autumn. Weak but mentally sharp, she requested family gathering. Before winter deepened, 4 generations assembled in the cabin. Thomas had expanded over decades to accommodate their growing family. She watched children play while adults discussed continuing challenges, border disputes, cultural preservation, economic pressures threatening balanced development. The pendant glowed against her aged skin as she addressed them finally. "This charm didn't create magic," she said firmly. "Choice created miracles. When fear says turn away, when hate strikes first, when prejudice says they'll never change, remember you always have power to choose differently." She pressed the pendant into Ruth's hand, completing its transfer officially. "Wear it not as decoration but as a reminder. Every day offers moments when we choose enemies or allies, division or understanding, the easy path of hatred or difficult, path of hope." Martha's children performed closing dance, movements speaking languages words couldn't capture. As music faded, Sarah felt complete. The woman who'd fled Burning Village carrying a child and fear had lived to see that child's children building something impossible to envision during nightmare's depths of the nightmare. She passed peacefully in sleep 3 weeks later. The very night a new star blazed briefly in the northern sky before winking out. Nipier's apprentices whispered that shooting stars mark important passages between worlds. Spirit, returning to a complete journey begun long ago. Sarah's funeral drew attendance from across territory and beyond. Federal officials who'd once doubted the experiment's viability praised its enduring matriarch. Tribal leaders shared sacred songs, usually reserved for their own departed. Children's drawings covered one entire wall of the community center, depicting Sarah as a bridge between peoples rendered in colors only young artists dared combine. Ruth delivered eulogy that became inspiration for poem passed down through generations. She fled as stranger, arrived as enemy, left as family, returned as mother. To all who learned, love's shell contains ocean's vastness, where separated waters remember ancient unity, and hatred drowns in mercy's tide. 25 years of cooperation had proven that frontier need not mean frontier war. Sarah's story became legend, but living legacy continued through those who chose daily to honor principles she'd embodied. The pendant's passage through generations marked those committed to continuing the difficult work of building understanding. Across difference, Ruth passed it to Samuel, who would later give it to his daughter Eleanor, each bearer learning that transformation often began with simple acts of unexpected kindness. Two Rivers Crossing thrived beyond its founders' lifetimes, growing into a city that influenced national policy on cultural integration. Universities studied its legal innovations. Communities worldwide requested consultation on replicating its success, but core truth remained. No structure could replace individual choices to see humanity in others despite taught prejudices. No law could mandate compassion. No treaty would enforce trust. Transformation happened one interaction at a time, when people chose bridge over barrier, alliance over enmity, shared future over inherited division. The rivers continued their eternal merger, indifferent to human meanings imposed upon them. Yet their example inspired countless generations to remember. Different streams could join without losing identity, creating something stronger than either alone. In their flowing communion lay a perpetual lesson about frontiers. They need not be borders dividing peoples, but meeting places where diverse traditions converged to create something entirely new. And in those meetings, when approached with courage to choose differently than history demanded, lay hope that humanity might transcend ancient divisions to discover unity within diversity. Recognizing finally that our greatest strength emerged from learning to honor rather than eliminate difference. The pendant's legacy lived on not in its carved surface, but in hearts willing to carry its message forward. That sometimes, when survival demanded impossibility, choosing mercy over vengeance could transform not just individual lives, but shape the destiny of nations, learning slowly to live together upon shared frontier earth. Through generations yet unborn, the story would continue, not as faded history, but as a living choice made new each morning by those who remembered that enemies need not remain so, that frontiers could become bridges, and that in humanity's darkest hours often dawned the possibility of its greatest transformations. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.